The clock's hand swept counterclockwise across its painted face, ticking backward through the hours in the silent front parlor, a sound the deputy would later say he could not stop hearing for weeks afterward. He stood in the doorway of the small house on Elm Street, his flashlight beam catching dust motes suspended in the cold October air, and beyond the overturned reading chair, beyond the spilled cup of tea gone long cold on its saucer, Astrid Lindqvist lay still upon her own parlor floor. The clock kept ticking backward, steady, indifferent, marking time toward some hour that had already passed, rather than one still to come. And no one in Stromsburg, Nebraska, yet understood that the strange, reversed mechanism above the mantel held within it the entire truth of what had happened to her. Before we proceed to the story, please consider subscribing to Calis-Crime Vault if you haven't, and hit like too. It's truly appreciated and helps me to keep creating similar and interesting cold case stories. Back to the story. The small town of Stromsburg, Nebraska, sits in the heart of Polk County, a community founded in the 1870s by Swedish immigrants who carried their language, their faith, and their careful craftsmanship across an ocean and into the rolling farmland of the American plains, a heritage the town still celebrated each summer with its own festival of Swedish culture even a century later. The town's main street reflected this heritage plainly, its modest storefronts built by the same immigrant families whose descendants still operated many of the same businesses generations later. A community where the Swedish Lutheran Church remained the true center of social life, and where 3 generations of the same family often still lived within a few blocks of one another. The town's annual summer festival celebrating its Swedish heritage drew visitors from across the entire region each year, featuring traditional folk, dancing, handcrafted goods, and the same recipes for Swedish pastries that had been passed down through Stromsburg families for over a century. A celebration Astrid herself had always attended faithfully, occasionally offering her own considerable sewing skill to help repair traditional costumes worn during the festival's folk dance performances. Longtime residents recalled that Astrid had taken particular joy in the festival each year, one of the few occasions when her otherwise reserved manner gave way to genuine visible delight, a detail neighbors found especially poignant once the full truth of her hidden past finally came to light decades later. Stromsburg had grown, by the late 1980s, into a modest farming community of just under 1,200 residents, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else by name but large enough to support its own small downtown business district, including the modest dress shop where Astrid Lindqvist had built her own quiet, respected place within the community over the preceding decade. Polk County itself remained, throughout the 1980s, a predominantly agricultural region, its economy built around the same corn and soybean farming that had sustained the area's Swedish immigrant founders for over a century. A steady, unhurried rhythm of rural life that gave Stromsburg's residents both the close community bonds and the occasional isolation that so often define small farming towns across the American Midwest. The town's identity had always been shaped by this careful, patient character. Its residents, proud of the craftsmanship their immigrant ancestors had brought with them and determined to preserve it across each succeeding generation, a value system that had, in its own quiet way, made Astrid Lindqvist's own considerable sewing skill feel like a genuinely welcome addition to the community's own broader cultural heritage the moment she first arrived in 1979. Astrid Lindqvist was 39 years old in the autumn of 1989, a quiet, deeply private seamstress who ran a small dress shop on Main Street and who had emigrated from Sweden a decade earlier, settling into Stromsburg's tightly knit Scandinavian community with a warmth that endeared her to neighbors even as she remained, in ways many of them noticed, but never quite understood, carefully guarded about the life she had left behind. Friends who knew her best throughout her decade in Stromsburg later said, once the truth finally emerged, that they had always sensed some private sorrow beneath her generally warm and cheerful demeanor, a quiet undercurrent they had respectfully never pressed her to explain, assuming it reflected nothing more than the ordinary homesickness so many immigrants carried for the countries and families they had left behind. Customers at her small dress shop remembered Astrid as a woman of exceptional patience and skill, someone who could transform an ordinary hemline alteration into a small act of genuine craftsmanship, often staying late into the evening to ensure a garment fit exactly as a customer had hoped. Several longtime customers recall that Astrid had a particular gift for making every client feel genuinely valued, remembering small personal details about their families and their lives that made even the most routine alteration feel like a warm, personal exchange rather than a simple business transaction. One former customer, interviewed decades later following the trial, recalled that Astrid had once stayed open well past her usual closing hour to complete an urgent alteration for a young bride's wedding dress after a last-minute fitting revealed the garment needed additional adjustment. A small act of generosity, the woman said she had never forgotten across the following decades, a fitting reflection, she said, of the quiet warmth that had defined every interaction she ever had with Astrid. That same former bride, now a grandmother herself, told a reporter that she had kept the wedding dress Astrid altered for her carefully preserved for over 3 decades, and that learning the full truth of Astrid's own courage and hidden history had given the garment an entirely new and deeper significance within her own family story. She had arrived in Stromsburg in 1979 with little more than a single suitcase and a modest collection of sewing tools, and had built her small business slowly and carefully over the following decade, earning a reputation throughout Porch County as the finest seamstress within easy driving distance, a skill she had first learned from her own grandmother back in Sweden. A woman Astrid rarely spoke of, but whose careful, patient teaching clearly lived on in every stitch Astrid herself completed. The mantel clock itself, Christina would later learn, had originally belonged to that same grandmother, a modest but well-crafted timepiece passed down through the family for 2 generations before Astrid brought it with her across the ocean, one of only a handful of possessions she carried when she left Sweden so suddenly in the autumn of 1979. The clock's original forward-moving mechanism had functioned perfectly well for decades before Astrid herself, within her first year in Stromsburg, commissioned its unusual modification, a decision that puzzled the local clockmaker who completed the work at the time, but that he agreed to complete regardless, professional discretion being, as Astrid herself reportedly told him, worth considerably more to her than any explanation of her reasons. That original clockmaker, long since retired by the time the case was finally solved, was located and interviewed by Detective Ingram once the reinvestigation began, and he recalled the unusual commission clearly even decades later, telling Detective Ingram that Astrid had specifically requested both the reversed mechanism and, though he had not fully understood the request at the time, a small modification to the case itself that would have allowed for exactly the kind of concealed compartment Thomas Reyes eventually discovered, a request the elderly clockmaker said he had simply assumed reflected some private, sentimental purpose he had never felt it his place to question. She lived alone in a modest house on Elm Street, kept a small but immaculate garden, and was known throughout the community for the careful, patient skill she brought to her work, mending and tailoring garments for half the families in town across the 10 years she had called Stromsburg home. A quiet devotion to her craft that neighbors remembered fondly for years afterward. On the evening of October the 9th, 1989, a neighbor noticed Astrid's porch light still burning well past its usual hour and, growing concerned when repeated knocking brought no answer, contacted the Porch County Sheriff's Office. A call that would begin an investigation into Astrid Lindqvist's murder that would remain unsolved for the following 27 years. That neighbor, a woman named Elsie Bergstrom, who had lived across the street from Astrid for nearly the entire decade she had resided in Stromsburg, later told investigators that she had grown genuinely concerned only when Astrid failed to appear the following morning to open her dress shop, an absence entirely out of character for a woman whose reliability had become something of a small-town institution in its own right. Elsie recalled standing on Astrid's front porch that evening, knocking with growing urgency, and finally trying the front door herself, only to find it unlocked. A discovery that filled her with an immediate and overwhelming dread even before she stepped inside to find what had actually happened. Elsie testified decades later at Henry Dale's trial, her own memory of that terrible evening remaining, by her own account, as vivid and undiminished, as if the discovery had occurred only weeks earlier rather than nearly 3 decades before. She told the jury that Astrid had always kept her porch light burning as a small, ordinary courtesy to neighbors passing by after dark, a detail that made its continued illumination well into the following morning immediately and unmistakably wrong to anyone who knew Astrid's own careful, consistent habits. Sheriff Elmer Sackett, a steady, thoughtful lawman who had served Polk County for nearly 2 decades, arrived at the small house on Elm Street to find Astrid dead in her own front parlor, the victim of a blunt force injury that had ended her life sometime earlier that same evening. Sheriff Sackett had built a reputation across the county for his careful, methodical approach to investigations, and colleagues recalled that he personally walked through Astrid's small house multiple times that first evening, determined not to overlook any detail that might explain the violence that had so suddenly and inexplicably ended the life of a woman the entire community had come to genuinely cherish. The scene presented Sheriff Sackett with troublingly little to work from. No forced entry, no obvious struggle beyond an overturned reading chair, and no immediate indication of what had brought such sudden violence into the quiet, orderly life of a woman so universally well regarded throughout the community. Sheriff Sackett noted one detail in his original report that struck him, even in those first disorienting hours, as genuinely strange: an antique mantel clock above the parlor fireplace whose hands moved steadily counterclockwise, ticking backward through the hours in a manner Sheriff Sackett had never before encountered in his many years of investigating homes across the county. He mentioned the peculiar clock to his own wife that same evening, later telling colleagues it was the detail from that terrible night he found himself thinking about most often across the following years. An object he could never quite convince himself was entirely meaningless despite lacking any way to connect it to the investigation itself. The investigation that followed consumed Sheriff Sackett's department for months, canvassing the entire town in search of anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that October evening, interviewing Astrid's customers, her fellow Swedish Lutheran congregants, and every neighbor along Elm Street. A process that revealed remarkably little beyond the universal affection the community held for a woman most residents described as kind, careful, and quietly reserved about anything concerning her life before Stromsburg. Astrid's own pastor at the Swedish Lutheran Church, interviewed at length given his close pastoral relationship with her over the preceding decade, told investigators that Astrid had attended services faithfully every Sunday without fail, often staying afterward to help with the church's various charitable efforts, but that she had never once, across all their years of acquaintance, spoken to him directly about her life or family back in Sweden, a reticence he had always respected as a private matter rather than something requiring further inquiry. Deputies spoke with dozens of Astrid's regular customers, many of whom had known her for the better part of a decade, and each interview produced the same consistent portrait: a woman who gave freely of her skill and her warmth while revealing almost nothing of her own past, a private reserve residents had always respected without ever thinking to question. Astrid's landlord, questioned extensively given his knowledge of her personal affairs, could offer investigators nothing beyond the observation that Astrid paid her modest rent faithfully and kept entirely to herself regarding any family or history predating her arrival in Nebraska a decade earlier. He recalled, when pressed further, that Astrid had once mentioned in passing that she had left Sweden to build a new and simpler life, an offhand comment he had never thought to question further at the time, one that would take on considerable new significance decades later once the full truth of her past finally came to light. Astrid's landlord, A widower named Carl Anderson, who had rented the small house on Elm Street to Astrid since her earliest days in Stromsburg, told investigators in 1989 that she had always paid several months' rent in advance whenever possible, a habit he had always assumed reflected simple financial caution rather than anything more significant, though he later admitted, once the truth finally emerged, that he wondered whether it had instead reflected some quiet, persistent uncertainty about how long she might ultimately be able to remain safely in any single place. No physical evidence beyond a single unidentified partial fingerprint recovered from the parlor's window frame offered investigators any meaningful path forward. And by the following spring, the case had settled into the particular, uneasy dormancy so many small-town unsolved deaths eventually come to occupy. The Stromsburg community continued to speak of Astrid's death for years afterward with a particular hushed sorrow, a story that became something of a permanent fixture in the town's collective memory, spoken of each October with the same careful, respectful uncertainty that so often surrounds a beloved community member's unresolved passing. The Swedish Heritage Museum itself held a small annual remembrance display each October in the years before the case was finally solved. A modest collection of Astrid's own sewing tools, and a photograph loaned by Christina, a quiet, informal tribute that longtime residents visited faithfully, even without any clear answer to the question of who had taken her life or why. Several of Astrid's former customers organized an informal knitting circle in her memory that continued meeting for years, a small but meaningful way of keeping her own careful, patient spirit present within the community even as the mystery surrounding her death remained frustratingly unresolved. Sheriff Sackett himself never fully set the case aside, reviewing the thin file personally each October for the remainder of his own career, a private ritual his own deputies came to recognize as reflecting just how deeply the case's lack of resolution weighed on a man otherwise known throughout the county for his calm, unflappable professional demeanor. Sheriff Sackett retired from the department in 2001, 15 years before the case was finally solved, and colleagues who visited him in his retirement later said he continued asking after the case every time their paths crossed, always with the same quiet, persistent hope that someday, somehow, the truth behind Astrid's death might finally come to light. He passed away in 2011, 5 years before Thomas Reyes's discovery finally broke the case open, a fact Christina has said she finds particularly poignant, wishing the sheriff who had first documented that strange backward clock so many decades earlier could have lived to see the very object he once dismissed as simple eccentricity ultimately prove to hold the entire truth of the case within it. Astrid's niece Christina Lindqvist Hoyt, living in Lincoln at the time of her aunt's death, became the family's most persistent advocate over the following decades, traveling to Stromsburg periodically to meet with successive sheriffs and to maintain, faithfully, whatever connection to the case the passing years allowed. Christina had been close to her aunt throughout her own childhood, treasuring the summers she had spent visiting Astrid's small house on Elm Street, and she inherited what modest estate her aunt left behind, including the strange backward-running clock, an heirloom she kept carefully but rarely displayed, uncertain what to make of an object that had always struck her as carrying some private significance she had never been able to fully understand. Christina recalled, in interviews following the case's eventual resolution, that her aunt had always kept the clock in a place of quiet prominence within the parlor, dusting it with particular care during Christina's own childhood visits, a small but consistent devotion that Christina had once assumed reflected nothing more than simple sentimental attachment to a family heirloom carried across an ocean. Christina had moved the clock into her own home immediately following her aunt's death, placing it in a spare bedroom rather than any prominent living space, later explaining that its strange backward movement had always unsettled her slightly, a quiet discomfort she had never fully been able to explain even to herself across the following 27 years. She had considered on several occasions simply having the clock's mechanism corrected to move forward normally, a change that would have been simple enough for any competent clockmaker to complete, but had always ultimately decided against it, telling a reporter that some instinct she never fully understood had always urged her to leave the peculiar heirloom exactly as her aunt had left it. She wrote letters to the Polk County Sheriff's Office each October on the anniversary of her aunt's death for over 2 decades, a ritual she maintained faithfully even as successive sheriffs came and went and the file grew thicker with years of inactivity rather than progress, never once allowing herself to fully believe the case would remain forever unsolved. Now, before we continue into what that strange backward running clock ultimately revealed, take a moment, if this story has moved you, to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next case we bring to light together. And turn on your notifications so you will be there the moment we return with more stories told with the care and the respect they deserve. Thank you, and let us return now to Stromsburg and to a secret that had waited 27 years quietly ticking backward to finally be understood. In 2016, Christina Lindqvist Hoyt, by then in her own later middle age and preparing to downsize from the family home where she had kept her aunt's modest estate for over 2 decades, decided to have the old backward running clock properly restored before donating it to the Stromsburg Swedish Heritage Museum, a gesture she hoped might finally give the peculiar heirloom a fitting and lasting home. Christina had spent months slowly sorting through decades of accumulated family belongings in preparation for her own move to a smaller retirement home, a process she later described as unexpectedly emotional. Each object she handled carrying its own small weight of memory from a family whose losses had always felt, to her, somehow incomplete given the unresolved nature of her aunt's death. She had considered simply keeping the clock in storage indefinitely as she had for over 2 decades, but ultimately decided that a proper museum donation would honor her aunt's memory more fittingly than continuing to leave the strange heirloom boxed away and largely forgotten. A decision she has since said she considers, in hindsight, the single most consequential choice of her entire life. She brought the clock to a horologist named Thomas Reyes, a careful craftsman who had built a considerable regional reputation for his meticulous restoration of antique timepieces, and who approached Astrid's clock with the same thorough, curious attention he brought to every piece that came through his small workshop. Thomas had trained under a master clockmaker in Chicago before returning to Nebraska to open his own modest restoration business, and colleagues throughout the regional antique trade regarded him as one of the finest specialists in the entire Midwest, a reputation built over nearly 30 years of painstaking, detail-oriented work restoring pieces that range from simple farmhouse clocks to elaborate Victorian mechanisms. His workshop, located in a converted barn on the outskirts of a small Nebraska town roughly an hour from Stromsburg, had become something of a regional destination for families seeking to properly restore treasured heirlooms, and Thomas maintained a waiting list that often stretched several months given the meticulous, unhurried standard he insisted upon for every piece that came through his doors. Thomas has said in the years since the Lindqvist case brought him unexpected public attention, that he has never once considered raising his rates or expanding his operation beyond its modest single craftsman scale, insisting that the careful, personal attention each piece receives remains the entire foundation of both his professional reputation and his own genuine love of the work itself. Thomas kept meticulous records of every piece that passed through his workshop, a habit born of professional discipline that would, in Astrid's case, ultimately prove essential to documenting exactly how and when the clock's hidden secret was finally uncovered. Thomas noted almost immediately, upon opening the clock's rear housing to examine its mechanism, that the reversed movement had been deliberately and skillfully engineered rather than reflecting any accident or malfunction, the work, he recognized, of a genuinely accomplished clockmaker who had modified the piece with clear and careful intention. He spent several days researching the specific mechanical approach used in the modification, eventually identifying the particular style of gear reversal as consistent with techniques favored by clockmakers trained in a specific Swedish tradition, a detail that struck him as unusual enough to warrant closer examination of the piece as a whole, rather than simply proceeding with a standard restoration. Thomas photographed every stage of his examination meticulously, a habit of careful documentation he maintained for every piece passing through his workshop, records that would later prove valuable to investigators piecing together the exact timeline and circumstances of his eventual discovery. It was while examining the clock's housing more closely that Thomas Reyes discovered a small, cleverly concealed compartment built into the base of the case, a detail so carefully integrated into the original craftsmanship that it had remained entirely undetected for 27 years. Thomas later described the particular quiet astonishment of that moment, working alone in his workshop late one evening, running his fingers along a seam in the wood that seemed, upon careful inspection, subtly different from the surrounding grain. A craftsman's instinct honed across decades of work that led him to press gently until a small hidden panel finally gave way. Inside, wrapped in a small square of yellowed cloth, Thomas found a folded letter written in Swedish and a single faded photograph of a young man, along with a brief handwritten note in English, addressed to whoever might someday find it, explaining that if anything ever happened to her, this letter and photograph would identify the man Astrid feared above all others. Thomas Reyes, recognizing immediately the profound significance of what he had found, contacted Christina Lindqvist Hoyt directly, and the two of them brought the discovery to the Polk County Sheriff's Office within days, finally reopening a case that had remained cold for over a quarter century. Detective Paula Ingram, newly assigned to lead the department's small cold case efforts, took immediate charge of the reopened investigation, arranging for Astrid's letter to be professionally translated from its original Swedish and beginning the painstaking work of identifying the young man in the accompanying photograph. Detective Ingram had joined the Polk County Sheriff's Office 6 years earlier after beginning her career in a larger department in Omaha, and had specifically requested the transfer to the smaller, quieter county specifically for the opportunity to work more closely and personally with the kind of long, unresolved cases that rarely received sustained attention in a larger, busier jurisdiction. Colleagues who worked alongside her described a detective who approached even the department's oldest, most seemingly unsolvable files with genuine determination, often researching new investigative techniques on her own time in hopes of finding fresh avenues for cases traditional methods had long since exhausted. She had reviewed the Lindqvist file closely during her first months in the position, struck immediately by the strange, unexplained detail of the backward-running clock that Sheriff Sackett had so carefully documented decades earlier, a detail she found herself returning to periodically over the following years, unable to fully shake the sense that it held some significance no one had yet managed to uncover. She arranged for the translation to be completed by a professor of Scandinavian languages at the University of Nebraska, a careful process that took several weeks given the letter's aged condition and the formal, somewhat archaic Swedish in which Astrid had originally written it. The translated letter revealed a story Astrid had apparently carried in complete silence throughout her entire decade in Nebraska, describing a broken engagement in Sweden to a man named Henrik Dahl, whose reaction to her decision to end their relationship had grown, in the months that followed, into an obsessive and increasingly threatening fixation that had ultimately compelled Astrid to flee her homeland entirely, settling quietly in America under her own unchanged name but taking considerable care never to disclose her whereabouts to anyone who might inadvertently reveal them back home. Astrid's letter described in careful and measured Swedish prose the specific pattern of Henrik's behavior in the months before her departure, unexpected appearances outside her family's home, letters delivered at all hours insisting they were meant to be together, and a mounting sense of dread she said she had never been able to fully explain to her own family without sounding, in her own words, as though she were exaggerating an ordinary broken engagement into something far more serious than those around her believed it to be. She wrote that she had chosen not to involve the Swedish police directly, uncertain whether Henrik's behavior, troubling as it felt to her personally, would be taken seriously enough to warrant any real intervention. A decision she said she had come in the years since to regard as her only genuine regret regarding how she had handled the entire situation. Detective Ingram, working with both American and Swedish immigration records, traced Henrik Dahl's own path across the following years, discovering that he too had emigrated from Sweden not long after Astrid's own departure, settling eventually in a small Iowa town under the anglicized name Henry Dale. A modest change that had nonetheless proven sufficient to obscure any obvious connection between the respected, elderly Iowa farmer he had become and the man Astrid had once fled halfway across the world to escape. Detective Ingram spent several weeks working through decades of immigration and naturalization paperwork, a painstaking process complicated by the informal, often inconsistent record-keeping common to immigration processing in the late 1970s, before finally confirming, through a combination of birth records and naturalization documents, that Henry Dale of rural Iowa and Henrik Dahl of Sweden were, beyond any reasonable doubt, the very same man. She corresponded directly with Swedish authorities as part of this process, requesting archived records that ultimately confirmed Henrik Dahl's own departure from Sweden in the months following Astrid's disappearance, a timeline that aligned precisely with the account Astrid herself had described in her hidden letter. Detective Ingram later said that the moment she finally laid the two identities side by side, matching birth dates, physical descriptions, and even a small distinguishing scar noted in both sets of records, represented one of the most quietly satisfying moments of her entire investigative career. The final confirmation that the man she sought had indeed been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. She discovered that Henry Dale had built, over his own 3 decades in America, a modest but genuinely respected life as a farmer, serving for a time on his local county fair board, and attending the same small Lutheran church nearly every Sunday, an outwardly ordinary existence that gave no indication whatsoever of the violence in his own past. Neighbors in Henry's own Iowa community later described him, once his arrest became public, as an unfailingly polite and community-minded man, someone who had volunteered for years helping organize the county fair's annual livestock competition, and who had never once, in over 3 decades of acquaintance, given any of them reason to suspect the darkness he had carried so completely hidden beneath his own quiet, respectable exterior. One longtime Iowa neighbor told a reporter that the revelation had left the entire community deeply shaken, forcing many of them to reckon, much as Stromsburg itself once had regarding Astrid's own hidden past, with just how little any of them had truly known about a man they had considered a trusted friend for the better part of 30 years. Detective Ingram located Henry Dale, then 81 years old and still living quietly on the same modest farm he had purchased decades earlier, and requested a voluntary fingerprint sample as part of the broader reinvestigation. An unremarkable request Henry Dale agreed to without apparent hesitation, evidently confident that whatever connection investigators were pursuing could not possibly reach back to him after so many undisturbed years. The comparison, completed within weeks, matched Henry Dale's fingerprint conclusively to the partial print recovered from Astrid's parlor window frame in 1989, a match that transformed a decades-old mystery into an active homicide investigation aiming, for the first time, a specific and living suspect. Detective Ingram approached the elderly man at his own farmhouse, choosing a quiet, private setting rather than a formal interrogation room, given his advanced age, aware that whatever truth he had carried for nearly 3 decades deserved to emerge, if it emerged at all, through patient questioning rather than confrontation alone. She had prepared extensively for the interview, reviewing Astrid's translated letter in full detail, and consulting with a psychologist familiar with cases involving long-term obsessive fixation, an approach designed to help her recognize and respond appropriately to whatever emotional strategy Henry might employ once confronted with the evidence against him. Detective Ingram brought a Swedish-speaking colleague from a neighboring department to assist with portions of the interview, ensuring no possible misunderstanding might arise from Henry's own still heavily accented English, a precaution that proved unnecessary once Henry began speaking, but that Detective Ingram considered essential given the gravity and complexity of what she anticipated the interview would ultimately reveal. Confronted with both the fingerprint match and the letter recovered from within the clock itself, Henry Dale's composure, sustained across nearly 3 decades of an ordinary, unremarkable American life, finally began to give way. In a halting, heavily accented voice, he told Detective Ingram that he had, in fact, tracked Astrid to Nebraska in the autumn of 1989, having spent years quietly searching for her whereabouts after her sudden disappearance from Sweden, and that he had traveled to Stromsborg intending, in his own words, only to speak with her, to understand why she had left him so completely and so silently. He described years of quiet, methodical searching, writing to distant relatives, checking immigration records available to him at the time, and finally, through a chance conversation with a fellow Swedish immigrant, learning of a woman matching Astrid's description running a small dress shop in a Nebraska farming town, a search he characterized, even in his own confession, as driven by love rather than any darker motive, an explanation Detective Ingram found difficult to reconcile with everything Astrid's own letter had described. Henry told Detective Ingram that he had spent nearly 8 years pursuing the search before finally confirming Astrid's location, corresponding periodically with other Swedish immigrants he had come to know through his own community in Iowa, always asking, in what he described as casual conversation, whether anyone had encountered a seamstress matching Astrid's particular description and manner. He described the moment he finally received confirmation of her whereabouts from a traveling salesman who had passed through Stromsborg and mentioned, in an entirely unrelated conversation, a remarkably skilled Swedish seamstress running a small shop there, a chance detail that Henry said struck him immediately, after so many years of fruitless searching, as unmistakably describing the woman he had never stopped looking for. Henry described visiting Astrid's small house on the evening of October the 9th, an encounter that began, according to his own account, calmly enough, before Astrid's continued and unwavering refusal to resume any relationship with him triggered in him a sudden, overwhelming rage he insisted he had never intended to act upon when the visit began. He described the particular shock of seeing Astrid again after so many years of searching, standing in her own doorway looking, he said, exactly as he remembered her, an emotional collision of hope and desperation that he claimed overwhelmed his own better judgment the moment she made clear, in calm and unmistakable terms, that she had no intention of ever returning to him or to the life they had once shared together. Investigators, reviewing his account against the physical evidence recovered from the scene decades earlier, found the framing of a single unplanned moment of anger difficult to fully reconcile with the deliberate, sustained years of searching that had brought him to Stromsborg's doorstep in the first place. Evidence the prosecution would later argue reflected a far deeper and more calculated obsession than Henry's own account allowed. Henry maintained throughout his questioning that he had never once, across the following 27 years, told a single living soul of what had actually occurred that October evening, building an entirely new identity and an entirely new life in Iowa specifically to ensure the truth would never be discovered, a secret, he said, he had carried in complete isolation for nearly 3 decades. He described returning to Iowa the same night, driving through the darkness in a state of what he characterized as complete shock, and deciding within days to formally change his name and to distance himself entirely from anything connecting him to his life in Sweden. A decision, he said, reflected less any careful long-term plan than a desperate, immediate need to simply disappear from the life he had just so irrevocably shattered. He told Detective Ingram that he had married a local Iowa woman several years later, a marriage that lasted until her own death a decade before his arrest, and that he had never once across their entire marriage told her anything of his life before Iowa. A secret he carried even into what he described as an otherwise genuinely loving and ordinary partnership. Henry described the particular strain of maintaining the secret across nearly 3 decades of married life, telling Detective Ingram that he had constructed an entirely fabricated account of his own early years in Sweden, one his wife had accepted without question throughout their entire marriage, never once suspecting the true and devastating history her husband had carried silently beside her for the whole of their life together. He said he had considered on several occasions across the years, finally confessing the truth to his wife before her own death, but had ultimately never found what he described as sufficient courage to do so. A regret, he said, he carried alongside every other burden of his own extended, calculated silence. The formal arrest of Henry Dale took place quietly at his Iowa farmhouse in late 2016, deputies arriving to find the elderly man seemingly resigned to the moment, offering no resistance as he was read his rights and helped, slowly and carefully given his advanced age, into the waiting patrol car. News of the arrest spread through both Stromsburg and Henry's own quiet Iowa community within hours, and longtime residents on both sides of the state line later described a profound and disorienting shock, disbelief on the Iowa side that a respected, gentle farmer had for decades harbored so devastating a secret, and a complicated mixture of grief and relief on the Nebraska side that a case so many had quietly assumed would remain forever unsolved had finally, after 27 years, found its answer. Henry Dale's own adult stepchildren, from his marriage to his late Iowa wife, expressed profound shock at the arrest, one of them telling a reporter that they had never once, across their entire lives, sensed anything in their stepfather beyond the ordinary steadiness of a quiet, hard-working farmer. A statement that reflected the same bewildered disbelief so many in his own community felt in the weeks following his arrest. One stepdaughter, who had grown particularly close to Henry over the decades following her own mother's remarriage, told a reporter that she had always considered him a genuinely kind and patient stepfather. Revelation that left her struggling for months afterward to reconcile the man she had known with the crime he had ultimately confessed to committing so many years before she had ever entered his life. She said she had chosen, after considerable reflection, not to visit him in prison, telling the reporter that she needed time to fully process a truth that had upended her own understanding of a relationship she had once considered one of the most stable and loving of her entire life. The case moved to trial in the spring of 2017, and the Polk County Courthouse filled to capacity throughout the proceeding, a community forced to confront, after 27 years of uncertain memory, the full and devastating truth behind the quiet seamstress so many residents had known only as a gentle, private presence on Main Street. Local and regional newspapers covered the proceeding extensively, several outlets noting the remarkable, almost improbable circumstances by which the case had finally been solved. A decades-old murder unraveled not through any advancement in forensic science alone, but through one woman's own careful foresight, hidden within an ordinary household object for over a quarter century. The Columbus Telegram, the regional newspaper that had covered the original 1989 investigation extensively before the story gradually faded from regular coverage across the following decades, dedicated a lengthy series to the trial, tracing the case's full and remarkable arc from Astrid's own quiet arrival in Nebraska through to the eventual, astonishing resolution nearly 3 decades later. The Stromsburg community itself, still small enough that nearly every longtime resident had some personal connection to Astrid or her small dress shop, followed the trial with an intensity several courthouse staff described as unlike anything they had witnessed in their own years working the county's modest court system. Several of Astrid's former customers, women who had once brought their own garments to her small shop for careful alteration, attended portions of the trial themselves, several telling reporters that they had never fully stopped wondering, across nearly 3 decades, what had truly happened to the gentle, skilled seamstress who had once made their own daughters' wedding dresses with such evident care and pride. One such customer told a reporter that she found herself weeping openly during the trial's closing arguments, overwhelmed not only by the tragedy of Astrid's death, but by the quiet, remarkable courage her hidden letter finally revealed. A courage, the woman said, she wished she had somehow known to recognize and honor while Astrid was still alive to receive it. Christina Lindqvist Hoyt attended every day of the trial, telling reporters outside the courthouse that she had waited 27 years for exactly this reckoning, a moment made possible, she said, only by her aunt's own remarkable foresight in leaving behind a hidden message meant for a future she would never live to see. Christina took the stand briefly during the trial's second week, describing for the jury her aunt's gentle nature, her devotion to her craft, and the particular quiet warmth that had defined every summer visit Christina remembered from her own childhood. Testimony that visibly moved several jurors, and that courtroom observers later described as among the most affecting moments of the entire proceeding. She brought with her each day of the proceeding a small photograph of Astrid taken shortly before her death. A quiet, private talisman, she said, helped remind her, throughout the often difficult and technical testimony, of exactly what and whom the entire trial is ultimately about. The prosecution built its case around the fingerprint match, Astrid's own translated letter describing Henrik Dahl's obsessive fixation, and Henry Dale's formal confession, presenting the jury with a comprehensive picture of a man who had crossed an ocean to find a woman who had fled specifically to escape him, and who had ultimately taken her life rather than accept her final refusal. A forensic document examiner testified regarding the authenticity of Astrid's letter, confirming through careful analysis of the handwriting, the paper, and the ink that the document had indeed been written decades earlier and had remained sealed within the clock's hidden compartment exactly as Thomas Reyes discovered it. Testimony that established beyond doubt the letter's genuine, contemporaneous origin rather than any later fabrication. The examiner's testimony included a careful comparison of Astrid's handwriting samples against known Swedish paper and ink manufacturing standards from a relevant period, additional technical corroboration that left the defense with no meaningful avenue to challenge the letter's authenticity before the jury. The examiner walked the jury through the specific aging characteristics of both the paper and ink, comparing them against known samples from the same general period. Testimony several jurors later described as removing any lingering doubt about the letter's authenticity as a document written by Astrid herself, in her own hand, years before her death. Thomas Reyes himself testified as well, describing in careful, methodical detail the exact process by which he had discovered the hidden compartment, testimony that helped the jury understand precisely how a secret so carefully concealed had remained undetected for over a quarter century, waiting only for the right combination of careful craftsmanship and patient curiosity to finally bring it to light. Detective Ingram testified at length about the painstaking process of translating Astrid's words and tracing Henrik Dahl's own decades-long transformation into Henry Dale, walking the jury through the careful investigative work that had finally connected a quiet Iowa farmer to a murder committed nearly 3 decades earlier in a state he claimed, until his own confession, he had never once visited. She described for the jury the specific immigration and naturalization records that had ultimately confirmed Henry Dale's true identity, testimony that required considerable technical explanation, but that provided the jury with an independent, document-based confirmation of Henry's true history entirely separate from his own eventual confession. Detective Ingram also testified about the fingerprint comparison itself, explaining the specific methodology used to match Henry's voluntarily provided sample against the decades-old partial print recovered from Astrid's own window frame. Testimony that several jurors later cited as the single most conclusive piece of physical evidence presented throughout the entire trial. The defense, arguing that Henry Dale's actions reflected a single moment of uncontrolled emotional devastation rather than premeditated murder, pressed on his advanced age, his otherwise unblemished record across 27 years of quiet farming life, and his own account of a conversation that spiraled unexpectedly beyond his control. The defense called a psychologist who suggested that decades of genuine, sustained grief and longing could produce exactly the kind of sudden emotional collapse Henry described, an argument the prosecution challenged directly by pointing to the years of deliberate searching that had preceded the killing itself. Evidence, the prosecution argued, reflected calculated persistence rather than any simple, spontaneous loss of control. But the prosecution countered forcefully with a sustained years-long search that had brought him to Nebraska in the first place, and with the elaborate new identity he had constructed and maintained for nearly 3 decades, specifically to escape any consequence for his actions. Evidence, the prosecution argued, reflected a depth of calculation entirely at odds with a single unplanned outburst of grief and anger. The prosecutor reminded the jury in closing argument that Astrid Lindqvist had understood, with a clarity that ultimately proved tragically prescient, that the man she had once loved posed a genuine and lasting danger to her life, a fear she had carried in complete silence for a decade, confiding it only to a hidden letter she hoped, against all reasonable expectation, might someday find its way into the right hands. After 8 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just under 10 hours before returning a verdict finding Henry Dale, formerly Henrik Dahl, guilty of second-degree murder, persuaded that the sustained, years-long pursuit that had brought him across an ocean to Astrid's own doorstep reflected a depth of premeditated obsession the defense's account of sudden emotional collapse could not adequately explain. The jury foreperson later told reporters outside the courthouse that the panel had found the years of documented searching, culminating in his decision to travel from Iowa to Nebraska, specifically to confront Astrid, impossible to reconcile with any claim that what followed was purely spontaneous. A level of sustained intent the jury believed spoke to the true depth of Henry's obsession far more clearly than his own testimony ever acknowledged. Several jurors said afterward that Astrid's own letter, describing years of quiet fear predating her departure from Sweden, had weighed heavily in their deliberations, providing a clear and credible account, written entirely independent of the eventual trial, that directly contradicted Henry's own characterization of a relationship he insisted had ended amicably before his search for her began. One juror told a local reporter that reading Astrid's own words, translated and presented as evidence, had struck her as the closest thing to hearing directly from the victim herself that any of them had ever experienced in jury service, a testimony from beyond the grave that several panel members said ultimately proved more persuasive than any single piece of physical evidence presented throughout the entire trial. Judge Miriam Osterberg, addressing a packed courtroom at sentencing, told Henry Dale that he had not only taken Astrid Lindqvist's life, but had spent nearly 3 decades living quietly and undisturbed only a few hours from the very county where her family continued to grieve her, a proximity his own new identity had allowed him to maintain in complete and calculated safety. She spoke for several minutes about the particular cruelty of a truth withheld so completely and for so long, noting that Christina Lindqvist Hoyt had spent 27 years wondering what had truly happened to her beloved aunt, never once suspecting that the answer lay quietly hidden within an object she herself had kept safe throughout that entire uncertain wait. Judge Osterberg addressed Henry Dale's own claim of enduring love directly, telling him that whatever affection he believed he had once carried for Astrid Lindqvist, his actions on the night of her death and across the following 27 years reflected instead a profound and sustained disregard for her own clearly expressed wishes, a distinction the court considered essential to properly understanding the true nature of what he had done. She noted as well that Astrid's own hidden letter represented, in the court's own assessment, an act of extraordinary courage and foresight, a woman who, even in her final years of quiet fear, refused to let her own eventual fate go unexplained, ensuring instead that whoever might someday come looking would finally find the truth waiting patiently for them. She sentenced him to life imprisonment, a sentence that, given his advanced age, all present understood would mean he would spend whatever years remained to him behind bars. In the years since the trial, Stromsburg has slowly absorbed the remarkable and devastating truth behind a case that had waited 27 years, ticking backward within a quiet parlor clock, to finally be understood. Members of Astrid's own Swedish Lutheran congregation gathered for a special memorial service following the trial's conclusion, honoring her memory formally for the first time since her original 1989 funeral, a gesture the congregation's current pastor said felt long overdue. A proper and complete farewell finally offered to a woman whose full story the church community had waited nearly 3 decades to fully understand. Thomas Reyes, whose careful restoration work first uncovered the hidden compartment that ultimately solved the case, has continued his craft and has said publicly that he thinks often of the particular, almost impossible odds that led Astrid Lindqvist's own foresight to survive 27 years within an object no one had ever thought to examine closely enough. He has since become something of a minor celebrity within the antique restoration community, regularly invited to speak at regional horological conferences about the discovery, always careful in these talks to center Astrid's own remarkable courage rather than his own role in simply completing the restoration work she had, in a sense, always intended someone eventually to undertake. Thomas has said that the experience fundamentally changed his own approach to every subsequent restoration project, instilling in him a permanent habit of examining each piece that comes through his workshop with the same patient, curious thoroughness that first led him to discover Astrid's hidden compartment, aware now, in a way he never fully appreciated before, that even the most ordinary seeming antique might carry within it a story waiting decades to finally be told. Detective Ingram has continued her work leading the county's cold case efforts, crediting Astrid's own quiet courage as the true foundation of the case's eventual resolution. A woman who, even in her final years of fear, found a way to ensure the truth might someday outlive her. She has spoken at several regional law enforcement conferences about the case, using it as a teaching example for younger investigators on the importance of remaining open to genuinely unconventional sources of evidence, reminding her audiences that the truth in Astrid's case had waited nearly 3 decades inside an antique clock, a source no standard investigative protocol would ever have thought to examine without the fortunate intervention of one family's own decision to finally have a strange heirloom properly restored. Her presentations on the case have since become a regular fixture at regional cold case symposiums, and she has developed a formal training module specifically encouraging investigators to maintain open, ongoing communication with victims' families regarding any unusual personal belongings or heirlooms, insisting that Astrid's case demonstrates how such objects, however unlikely they may initially seem, can sometimes hold answers no traditional forensic method would ever uncover. Detective Ingram has also spoken candidly about the particular emotional weight of translating Astrid's letter personally, describing the experience of reading, in Astrid's own careful handwriting, a fear that had ultimately proven entirely justified, as one of the most affecting moments of her own career in law enforcement. She has said that she keeps a small printed copy of Astrid's translated letter in her own desk drawer at the Polk County Sheriff's Office, a private reminder she has told colleagues of exactly why patient, thorough investigative work matters, even when a case has sat unresolved for so many years that most people have long since stopped believing an answer might ever come. Christina Lindqvist-Hoyt has since donated the restored clock to the Stromsburg Swedish Heritage Museum exactly as she originally intended, though it now sits displayed alongside a small placard explaining its full and remarkable history, a permanent exhibit that draws visitors from across the region curious to see the strange backward-running clock that finally solved a 27-year-old murder. The museum's director has said that the clock has become, since its installation, one of the most discussed pieces in the entire collection. Visitors regularly asking staff to recount the full story behind the peculiar backward-moving hands, a living reminder of both Astrid's own courage and the broader Swedish immigrant community's own long history of quiet, patient resilience. The museum has since incorporated Astrid's story into its broader educational programming for visiting school groups, using her example to illustrate the particular courage so many immigrants throughout the region's history have needed to summon in building safe, independent lives far from their countries of origin. A lesson the museum's director says resonates powerfully with young visitors, regardless of their own family background. The exhibit includes, alongside the restored clock itself, a small reproduction of Astrid's own hidden letter, translated into English, allowing visitors to read in her own words the quiet courage and fear she had carried so completely alone for the better part of a decade. Christina has spoken publicly about the particular importance of listening carefully to the small, unexplained details a loved one leaves behind, telling audiences that she had kept her aunt's clock for over 2 decades without ever suspecting the profound truth quietly ticking away inside it. A lesson she says she hopes other families might carry forward regarding objects and mysteries of their own they may have too quickly dismissed as simple eccentricity. She has established a small memorial fund in Astrid's name at the local historical society, supporting the preservation of other Swedish immigrant family artifacts throughout Polk County. A tribute, she has said, reflects her aunt's own quiet, careful devotion to craftsmanship and memory alike. The fund has since supported the restoration of several other significant family heirlooms throughout the county, each project documented carefully by the Historical Society and occasionally, when families are willing, displayed alongside a brief account of the object's own history. A growing collection, Christina has said she hopes will encourage other families to look more closely at objects they may have too quickly dismissed as ordinary or unremarkable. The Historical Society's director has said that Astrid's own story and fund established in her memory has fundamentally reshaped how the organization approaches its broader preservation work, instilling a renewed institutional commitment to examining even seemingly modest family objects with genuine curiosity and care. Christina has also spoken, in her more personal reflections, about the particular comfort of finally understanding her aunt fully, telling a reporter that for over 2 decades she had wondered what private sorrow or worry might have shadowed Astrid's otherwise warm and generous nature, never imagining the full and courageous truth her aunt had carried alone for an entire decade before her death. She has said that she now visits her aunt's grave each October with a settled peace she never once experienced during the 27 uncertain years that preceded the case's resolution, finally able to grieve fully rather than continuing to carry the particular, unresolved weight of not knowing. To the younger generations coming of age in communities like Strömsburg and in small towns across this country very much like it, the story of Astrid Lindqvist carries a quiet but enduring lesson about the courage required to protect oneself even in complete isolation, about a woman who fled across an ocean, built an entirely new life, and still found a way, through nothing more than a cleverly modified clock, to ensure her own truth would someday be known regardless of what became of her. Detective Ingram has spoken about this lesson often since the trial, telling young people at community talks that Astrid's story represents one of the most remarkable examples of quiet, individual courage she has encountered across her entire career. A woman who, lacking any formal system of protection she could fully trust in a new country, built her own private safeguard through nothing more than patience, craftsmanship, and hope. It is a lesson, too, about the patient permanence of objects carefully preserved, about how Christina's own decision to finally have a strange family heirloom properly restored, rather than simply discarding it as an unexplained oddity, ultimately unlocked a secret that had waited 27 years for exactly that small act of curiosity and care. Christina Lindqvist Hoyt has spoken often, in her own continued advocacy work, about the particular importance of taking seriously the small, unexplained eccentricities that surround the people we love, telling audiences that her own aunt's quiet devotion to an oddly modified clock had always seemed, throughout her own childhood, like nothing more than a charming personal quirk, never once imagining the profound courage and fear it had actually represented. She has told community groups that she hopes young people understand Astrid's story not primarily as a tragedy, though it remains undeniably that, but as a testament to the particular resourcefulness immigrants throughout American history have so often needed to summon in building safe and independent lives far from everything and everyone they once knew. Christina has spoken specifically to groups of newly arrived immigrant families in the Omaha area, drawing direct connections between her aunt's own quiet courage and the challenges many new arrivals continue to face today, telling audiences that Astrid's story, though it ended in tragedy, ultimately stands as proof that even in complete isolation, in a country whose language and customs remain unfamiliar, it remains possible to build a life of genuine dignity, purpose, and quiet resilience. Thomas Reyes has offered a similar reflection in his own public talks, telling audiences that his work restoring Astrid's clock taught him a lasting respect for the idea that craftsmanship itself can carry meaning far beyond its immediate practical function, that an object built with sufficient care and intention can become, in the right circumstances, a genuine vessel for truth and justice across even the longest passage of time. Strömsborg today remains the same close-knit Swedish heritage community it always was, its main street storefronts still carrying the careful, proud craftsmanship of generations past. The small dress shop where Astrid once worked has long since closed, its building now home to a different local business, though longtime residents still occasionally point out the storefront whenever the subject of the town's own remarkable history comes up in conversation. The current business occupying the space, a small bakery, has kept a modest framed photograph of Astrid near its own front counter at the request of several longtime customers. A quiet, informal tribute the bakery's owners have said they intend to maintain for as long as they continue operating in the same historic building. The house on Elm Street where Astrid once lived, and where she ultimately died, was sold to a new family many years ago. Its current owners entirely unaware of the property's history until a curious neighbor eventually mentioned it, a detail they have since had only deepened their own quiet respect for the modest, well-kept home they now call their own. The current owners have said that learning the house's history did not diminish their affection for the property in the slightest, telling a reporter that they have come, in their own way, to feel a quiet sense of stewardship toward a home that once belonged to a woman whose courage and resilience they have since come to genuinely admire. But it is also now a town that finally understands a whole of its own story, one where a quiet, private seamstress once remembered only for the mystery surrounding her death is instead remembered fully and rightly, her courage and her hidden truth finally brought, after 27 long years, completely and permanently into the light. Before you go, if you find value and appreciate this story, please consider hitting subscribe and like the video, and turn on notifications too, so you don't miss the next interesting dramatized solved cold case video. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.